You now have Prisma binding all set up, and in this video, we're actually going to read and write from the database right here inside of Node.js. So we're going to spend some time looking at what exactly comes back on this Prisma object. We'll see how we can use that to perform all of the GraphQL operations we want to. Now, the cool thing is that all of this is actually going to read and write from the database. For the moment, we're going to work through some examples in this file just right down below. But once we understand how it works, we'll actually be integrating it into our resolvers for both queries and subscriptions as well as mutations. Now in this video, we are going to start to use asynchronous JavaScript, which is listed as a prereq for this class. So remember, in order to take this course, you need to know about Node and JavaScript. That includes asynchronous JavaScript, so things like callbacks, things like promises, and things like async await. If you don't know about these three things, you should go ahead and learn about them before continuing on with the course, because I am going to assume that you understand how they work. Now, maybe you've read a book or a blog post on them, that's fine. Maybe you took my beginner Node course, which covers all three, that's fine too. Or maybe you took a different course by a different instructor and learned about these, that's also okay. As long as you know about them, then you're ready to continue on. Now, I know someone's going to ask, why not cover them here? The point is that all three of these are fundamental JavaScript features. They're not specific to GraphQL in any way, and I don't want to take away from time spent on GraphQL to cover basic JavaScript. So that's why I've made the choice to not cover them here and list them as prereqs for the class instead. Now, that's not to say I'm not going to talk about how we're using them. As always, I'm going to describe what I'm doing in the code in great detail. I'm just not going to talk about their core underlying functionality. All right, let's go ahead and jump in. On this Prisma object, there are four key properties that we're going to be using. We have Prisma.query. This contains all of the queries we have access to. We have a Prisma.mutation. This contains all of the mutations we have access to. And we also have Prisma.subscription, which, as you can probably guess, contains all of the subscriptions we have access to. There's also one more. This is Prisma.exists. This contains some handy utility methods, which we'll be exploring later in this section. In this video in particular, we're just going to start with square one. We're going to start by exploring Prisma.query and figuring out how we can fetch data from the database right here inside of Node.js. Prisma.query itself is nothing more than an object. On that object, there are a set of methods available to you. There is one method for every query that the API supports. So for example, if I go over to GraphQL Playground and open up the schema, there is a method on that Prisma.query object for all of these queries, and we access it by name. So if I want to fetch the comments, I can use the comments method. If I want to fetch an individual post, I can use the post method. I'm going to go ahead and fetch some users. So right here, I will use Prisma.query.users, where the method name matches up exactly with the query name. So I have users sitting right here. Now with this in place, we can go ahead and call it as a function since it is one, and we can talk about the arguments that users accepts. All of our Prisma methods take two arguments. The first are your operation arguments, and the second is your selection set. Now we know that for some operations, like our mutations, they do require operation arguments. We have to provide data when creating a user. But for our user's query, the operation arguments are completely optional. So we're going to go ahead and ignore them by not passing any in. So right here, as the first argument, I am going to pass in null. Now, the second argument to all of our Prisma binding methods is the selection set. So I'm asking for all of the users, but what do I want about each user? Over here, for example, we're getting the user's ID, their name, their email, and the ID of any posts they're associated with. We can go ahead and provide our selection set as the second argument, and this is represented as a string. In here, we open and close a set of curly braces, and we list out all of the things we want, just like we list them out in the curly braces over here. We can do all of this on a single line. So I can say that for each user, I want their ID and their name, for example. I can also choose to grab their email. So now we have a completely valid operation. We are asking for the users, and we've provided our selection set. For each user, we want all of their scalar fields, ID, name, and email. Now, what comes back from the users function? Well, what comes back is actually a promise, which means that we need to use either then or catch to wait for the promise to resolve. This is an asynchronous operation, so it takes time to go off and make a request to the GraphQL Prisma API, and it takes time for Prisma to make a request to the underlying database. So we do not get the data back right here. Const users equals whatever comes back. This is not going to work as expected. We actually get a promise back, so we are going to wait for this promise to resolve by using the then method. So right here, .then, passing in our callback function. This is the function that's going to get called when the user's query is done, and it gets called with a single argument, the data that came back from the query. So the data argument is basically the same as what we see on the right-hand side over here. It represents the response from the API. So for our purposes, let's go ahead and just dump this data to the console, although later on we'll be integrating all of this into our resolvers files. Console.log data is going to get the job done. Now, before we actually run the project, we have to make a couple of small changes. First up, the protocol is required with the endpoint, so we want to put http:// up front. The other quick change we need to make is to index.js, because currently this file isn't even going to run. So in index.js, I'm going to import prisma.js just so the file actually executes. Right here, I'm going to add an import statement on. We're not grabbing any default or named exports, so we can leave off our exports list and the from keyword. We can just go right to the file name. The file we're trying to import is in the same directory as index.js, so ./prisma is going to get the job done. Now this, in effect, is just running the file, and that's all we want. We just want this file to run, so it actually executes our query and dumps our data to the console. With those changes in place, we can now head over to the terminal and run npm start to actually get our program up and running. I'm going to go ahead and fire that off. The program has started, and right here, what do we have? We have an array of objects. So since we have queried for users, we're going to get an array back, and each object represents a user. So we have Vikram1, Vikram2, and Andrew. Each object has those three properties. We have ID, we have name, and we have email. Now we could also change up our selection set to change the values that come back. For example, if I remove email and save the file, NodeMon is going to restart, and we're going to see that property is now gone. For each user, we just have the ID and the name. So the selection set is very important. It determines the structure of the data that comes back, which is exactly what we saw over in GraphQL Playground as well. So there we go. We now have our very first query in place, actually fetching data out of the Postgres database right inside of our Node.js app. We can also query for related data. For example, I can grab some information about the posts for all of these users, just like we do over here. Here we grab the ID for every post that belongs to a user. Let's do the same thing in Node.js. So we grab ID, we grab name, then we grab posts. Right after posts, we have to open and close another set of curly braces, and in here, we provide the selection set for posts. Let's say that we want the ID and the title for every post that belongs to the user. Now, if we go ahead and save prisma.js, we're going to see our data structure changes a little bit down below. For the first user, we have the posts array. It does indeed have an object inside of there. And for the second and third users, we can see that they have an empty array since they have no posts, which is indeed correct. The reason that we're not seeing the actual object data for this post is because the console is just hiding some of the output to prevent it from becoming too complex. We can fix that by switching up our console.log call. Right here, inside of the arguments list for console.log, I'm going to call JSON in uppercase .stringify. This is an easy way to convert a JavaScript object or array into JSON data, and that's going to allow us to customize how it's formatted in the output. We pass in 3 arguments. The first is the data, so we have our data object. The second is what's called a replacer function. This allows us to remove and replace properties. We don't want to do any of that. We just want to see our data as is, so we can pass in undefined for that second argument. And the third argument allows us to determine how many spaces we want to use when indenting our JSON. Common values would be 2 or 4. I'm just going to stick with 4. Now, if we save prisma.js once again, we're going to see that our data is much easier to read. Here we have our second and third users, neither of them having any posts. And if I scroll up, we have our first user. This one does have that posts property, and there is a single post inside of there. That post has the ID and title exactly as specified over here. So using Prisma binding from Node.js, we can do anything we would be able to do from GraphQL Playground. The advantage, though, is that it's actually inside of our code, so we can actually use it to build out our app. That's where we're going to stop for this video. Before we go, I do want you to run through a quick challenge querying for some other data. Down below, your challenge is to use Prisma binding to fetch all of the comments in the database. So right here, big picture goal, fetch comments using Prisma binding. Step 1, you want to use the comments query right inside of Node.js to fetch all of the comments. For each comment, grab the ID and the text, and also grab some of the associated data. Grab some information about the comment author. In this case, the ID and the name will suffice. Step 2, test your work by saving this file and making sure you actually see the data down below. You can use the same trick I used here with json.stringify to format the data and make it easier to see those nested data structures. All right, take some time to knock that out, test your work. When you're done, come back and click play. How'd that go? Let's go ahead and kick things off up above by using prisma.query. Right here, comments. So we have that comments query in our schema, which means we have a comments method on the query object. Now we know that comments doesn't require any operation arguments, so I'm going to pass in null, but we know we do have to provide our selection set. What do we want about each comment? I'm going to go ahead and provide my selection set right here in curly braces. I want the comment ID, I want the text value for the comment, and I also want some information about the comment's author. I'm going to choose to grab the ID and the name for the author. Perfect. Now with this in place, we do have to use the then method to actually wait for the data to come back. We provide our callback function, and then we get the data as the first and only argument. From here, we're just going to dump it to the console. So console.log. I'll use json.stringify once again, passing in those 3 arguments. We have our data, we have undefined for the second argument, and we have our indentation for the third. I'm going to indent by 2 spaces once again, and now we should actually be able to test our work. I'm going to save the file and view the terminal output. Now we're going to have 2 separate values printing. Right here, we have our array for comments. So I have my one comment. The text for the comment was a comment from a Prisma GraphQL. I have my ID, and I also have the author property with some information about the author. Here I have the author's ID and name, all as expected, based off of the selection set I provided. So there we go. We now know how to query data right inside of Node.js. We're going to continue on in the next video by looking at how we can use Prisma.mutation, and we're going to explore how we can pass in operation arguments. I'm excited to get to that, so let's go ahead and jump right in.